our job in governance, just as I feel my job as a farmer in stewarding the land, is to nurture the soil, make the environment as healthy and strong as possible for each plant to live to its fullest potential. And in governance, our job is to make the environment as fruitful and nutrient rich for each child to live to its fullest potential for our community, for their family, and for our society. And so one of the things for me that I really draw on in elected office, and the parallel I bring in with farming, is they both have to be addressing the issues in the moment. Sometimes you have a pest outbreak. Sometimes you have a coronavirus outbreak. I mean, heck, and at the same time, you have to deal with that emergency in the moment, but you also need to be planning long term. You need to be building your soil. You need to be building the infrastructure for a sound education and economy for your people. And so I really draw two very parallel lines of thinking from the two professions that I'm in.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from David Zuckerman, who operates Real Organic Project certified Full Moon Farm in Hinesburg, Vermont with his wife, Rachel Nevitt. They were part of our pilot program, so we are actually reaching into our vault and bringing out interviews that were conducted in the beginning years. David was Vermont's lieutenant governor from 2016 through 2020 and is currently on the ballot to take on that role again. Hi, David.
Hi, Linley. Good to chat with you.
I think we need more organic farmers in politics these days because there's so many things that intertwine. Tell me a little bit about what came first, organic farming or politics?
Fairly similar. I was organic farming for 2 seasons on a somewhat communal-like farm with this very visionary woman who had grown up on an old apple orchard. And she was in her later years and wanted to use the land in an organic way. Obviously, where the apple orchard was couldn't be done because of the old sprays that were used through the 40s through 60s and the arsenic. But in the open fields, I started farming with about 5 people living in our big farmhouse back in '94. And it was that summer that I was asked to run for office that summer and fall. So they somewhat happened at the same time. I didn't start my own farm until 1999, though, 5 years later.
Tell me how you came to be asked to run for office.
Well, I was a very active student at the University of Vermont on environmental issues. I had helped organize the 1990 Earth Day on campus. That was the 20th anniversary. I was really more interested in being a community activist and doing organizing from the ground up. And in 1992, I saw now everybody's famous Bernie Sanders speak. He was the Vermont congressman running for his first reelection. And he really inspired me. He was an independent. He didn't take corporate money. He wore his views straight up on his sleeve, obviously, as he still does today. He doesn't hide his views to finger to the wind kind of politician. And through that, I met local folks and got really involved in a couple campaigns from 92 to 94. And that spring, one of the other candidates said, "Hey, would you be my running mate for the 2-seat legislative district?" And I did lose that fall. I lost by 59 votes, but I tried again in 96 and was fortunate enough to succeed. And the rest, as we say, is history.
Talk a little bit about how confusing it is to be an eater and how we're being fooled.
Well, there are a lot of different ways that people are fooled. I mean, there's people that think GMO-free is basically organic, and there's a lot of variation there. People think that pastured is organic, and it isn't necessarily, although certainly I think pastured animals are I would prefer pastured animals over CAFO animals in a big way. And so there are so many details. I think it's really hard on the consumer when 98+% of them don't have any connection to farms anymore. There's maybe some of those who are older that grew up on a farm. So maybe it's 90% don't have a connection to farming and old school farming. But people don't know where their food comes from. And certainly with meat, many of them don't even want to know where it comes from. They get grossed out by the concept, even though they're more than happy to have meat every day for their meals. So it's a delicate balance of trying to show people the reality of just agriculture and how it's produced, and spooking them in ways that they might not want to then eat anymore, which of course we all have to eat. I have a funny story from when I was a kid growing up. We had a big garden growing up, thankfully, and I think that's part of what connected me to growing food. And we had company for dinner, and my mom said, "Hey, go up and dig some potatoes and we'll have them for dinner." New potatoes are so good and tender. And I went up with the other boy, we were probably 8 years old, and I brought up a shovel and started digging potatoes, and he was aghast. He was like, "Potatoes come from the ground? I can't eat that. They're dirty." And he wouldn't eat them. He would not eat them because they were dirty and from the ground. And that's in the 70s, late 70s. So a lot of people don't know where their food comes from anymore. And unfortunately, because of our economic circumstances, people basically want cheap food because we've been driving down wages, and working people are struggling so badly that they can't afford to buy the food at the price that it takes to grow holistic food and organic food, real organic food. So all of these social injustices and planetary injustices are interrelated. As long as we're not paying people well enough, they're not going to be able to buy the products that are much more reasonable for the planet and for their own health. And the cycle of a downward spiral will continue.
You touched a little bit on non-GMO. Could you explain to consumers why, and if you survey consumers, their number one thing that they're worried about is GMO. Second is organic, whether or not it's been sprayed. So talk about the confusion there with non-GMO actually does have pesticides on it most of the time.
Right. Yeah. So a couple things here. First of all, when we were working on our GMO labeling laws in Vermont, some of my conservative colleagues were saying, "You're doing this because it's going to help you as an organic farmer," and so forth. And I said, no, actually, highlighting GMOs is going to weaken some of the organic market because people are confusing non-GMO with organic, and the price point for non-GMO is going to be significantly lower than the price point for organic because you can still use herbicides and pesticides in GMO grown crop or non-GMO grown crops. You can still use certain fertilizers and atrazine and all these other chemicals, fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides in non-GMO crops. The only definition of non-GMO is that the genetic material was not altered originally in a lab using genetic material from usually non-related species. So there's a big misnomer out there that GMOs, or non-GMOs, I should say, are nearly organic. They are not at all an equivalence. I would say pastured animals, particularly 100% grass-fed or pastured animals, is a much closer thing to organic than non-GMO. But people are confused.
Yeah. So why did you want to label GMOs? Talk a little bit about that fight.
Well, for me, labeling GMOs was really important because while I'm an organic farmer and now a real organic project farmer, I still felt that the consumer needed to know what was going on in their food. Just as I think many would choose to buy organic and understand what organic is and how you're buying organic not only for your own health, but for the planetary health and to build soil. But it's also about having consumers know what is the food system. And GMOs greatly are a tool used by larger and larger industrial scale agriculture, where you just have thousands of acres, miles as far as you can see, of monocrop agriculture. And GMOs enable that. And one of the challenges with miles of monocrop agriculture is now you no longer have the diversity of habitat for all the different wildlife and wild plants that used to exist in many, many parts of the country and the world. And that's about species diversity and the health of the planet. And it's also about the health of that soil and the food people are eating, because if you're growing the same crop year in and year out, because you can spray certain pesticides over and over and over again, where, again, with organic agriculture, we rotate crops, we change practices to try to fool the pests or to get ahead of the pests. With GMOs, you can just do the same thing year in and year out. And the soil health, the water quality, and the food quality over time really does degrade. And I think people have a right to know so they can choose where they want to put their dollars in terms of supporting what system of agriculture they want to believe in.
Yeah, it says so much about the type of agricultural systems that we have that the GMO technology immediately went to use for herbicide tolerance. To me, it was just like, so we have a product to sell. Let's create a GMO so we can sell our herbicide. And that so much is about the industrialization of our food system. It's kind of like when Einstein, found something, in physics that then turned into an atomic bomb. It was just like, this is a really bad use of this technology.
Yep.
So GMOs are not part of organic. It's not part of the law. They're not allowed to be. So when you purchase organic, you're purchasing non-GMO plus pesticide free. And, somehow organic has been reduced down to this, it just means no spray, which isn't even actually what's happening, because there's this national list of 200 different substances, right? 200 plus, that, it's just replacement. There's an organic replacement for that herbicide or that fertilizer when it comes to hydroponics. Talk a little bit about what organic really does mean to people who have no idea. And unfortunately, many people who have no idea of what it means are on the National Organic Standards Board.
Right. So the definition of organic for me is really about the health of the soil, building the soil, and creating a more nutrient balanced environment for the plants for the future. Because if you have healthy soil, your plant is going to be stronger. It's going to be able to withstand minor pest assaults or different rain situations because the soil will hold more water and so forth. By law, it also means that we can't use synthetic pesticides and synthetic herbicides, and there are certain fertilizers we can't use because they're manufactured fertilizers versus naturally occurring fertilizers. And so organic is really about using the tools that were already naturally there. We have certain sprays we can use for certain pests. There are bacteriological sprays that we can use for certain worms, and caterpillars and bugs and so forth. We use integrated pest management. There are wasps that we can bring in that we do, little teeny wasps to get that little worm that you find in your corn sometimes. So we use the tools that nature already provided, and we don't use synthetic herbicides, pesticides, or fertilizers. But we do use pesticides and fertilizers. I can't think of very many herbicides that naturally existed. So I don't happen to use any other than fingers and hose and cultivation equipment for killing the weeds. But that's what it means as far as I'm understanding.
Yeah, and a lot of those fertilizers that we're using are slowly degrading compost or soybean meals. The hydroponic industry has taken soybean now, and it doesn't have to be organic. They've hydrolyzed it, which is a very energy intensive process, uses some synthetics. And that's what they're using as an organically approved fertilizer now. And, so many of those national list materials are not supposed to be the whole system. They're supposed to be just an amendment to the system when necessary, right? If you don't quite have enough fertility from last year's cover crop, give it a little bit more, right? But it's not like the entire system is now dependent on this national list.
Right. And it's about the inputs and whether you are building your soil over time or whether you believe or need immediate boosts. It's sort of like shots of caffeine to get you going. Well, if you got a steady, good, healthy diet and, the right amount of sleep and so forth, you tend to have the right amount of energy rather than the extreme ups and downs that, Red Bull will give you. Conventional agriculture is Red Bull and organic agriculture is fruit and vegetables and meat to, supplement your body's protein on occasion. So it's about longer term thinking and more stable levels of energy and nutrients.
Yeah, and that just reminded me of your Red Bull example. It's like health comes in the long term, like we can live to 100 or something like that. Whereas, the cows that are in these confinement systems eating grain, they live for 2 or 3 years and then they're sick and they're done. And so health is just such a long-term way of thinking about kind of integrated holistic systems. Would you talk a little bit about farming systems and the effect on nutrition, in your opinion?
Well, I'm not an expert in nutrition, but my understanding is the balance of nutrients in much of the food in organic is a better balance. We also try to grow more heirloom varieties of crops and not sort of hybridized crops that are down to a single peak need, which often is storage in the food system and or sugars, but actually the more rounded, well-rounded ancestry of the plants and the fruits and the vegetables that are grown. It's the nutrition balance is just like our own bodies. If you only ate vitamin C and you didn't have other vitamins, your body would be kind of out of whack. And organic farming is about balancing all of the different nutrients that the soil needs, the different nutrients that the plant needs, and then the plant is healthier. And just like we can be healthier for ourselves or not, that's what organic farmers are doing for their soil. And certainly real organic farmers, I should say. And, I told a story when I opened up the lieutenant governor. The first year I got elected was 2016. January of 2017, we had this new president that I'm not a huge fan of. But you only get to speak once as lieutenant governor. And otherwise, you're kind of the town moderator of the Senate. So in my speech, I gave to each of the 30 senators in Vermont one heirloom dry bean seed each. And they were all kinds of different beans. Some got big ones, small ones, pinto, lima, marfax, all these different kinds of beans, different colored beans, spotted beans. Each person got a bean. And I said, inside every single one of these seeds is the complete genetic potential to be a thriving, healthy, productive plant. However, the reality is, depending on the soil it's planted in, the health of that soil, the nutrients in that soil, and then once it sprouts, the weather that it gets, the pests or diseases that come at it, or the extreme cold or heat that comes at it, its ability to thrive is going to be deeply impacted by the environment that it's planted in and that it grows in. And I said, just like our children, every single child born has the potential to be anything, but they are greatly shaped by the environment around them, the household environment, the community environment, and so forth. And so our job in governance, just as I feel my job as a farmer in stewarding the land, is to nurture the soil, make the environment as healthy and strong as possible for each plant to live to its fullest potential. And in governance, our job is to make the environment as fruitful and nutrient rich for each child to live to its fullest potential for our community, for their family, and for our society. And so one of the things for me that I really draw on in elected office, and the parallel I bring in with farming, is they both have to be addressing the issues in the moment. Sometimes you have a pest outbreak. Sometimes you have a coronavirus outbreak. I mean, heck, and at the same time, you have to deal with that emergency in the moment, but you also need to be planning long term. You need to be building your soil. You need to be building the infrastructure for a sound education and economy for your people. And so I really draw two very parallel lines of thinking from the two professions that I'm in. And it really helps ground me, to use an agricultural term, when I'm in the political arena. Okay, we're working on the big picture, long term, while trying to put out momentary fires at the same time.
That's such a basic ecological principle, that there is health in diversity. And I know that there are people that are even trying to account for, species loss and that loss of biodiversity and how much that's worth, the cost on our society. And I don't know if you were able to come to the first Real Organic Project Symposium, but Onika Abraham said something that really impacted me, which was that, it's obvious to all us organic farmers in this room that the health of the soil is central to organic. And I'm challenged today to raise awareness that there is a lack of diversity in this room. And so I feel like we could learn so many things from health and biodiversity in the organic movement. And to me, that's always been part of the organic movement, and it's been lost with the industrialization of it. So for you, how does the knowledge of organic farming kind of relate to your feelings on racial diversity and what we need to be doing now?
There's no doubt. I know there's some great groups out there working to diversify people in agriculture as a whole, and certainly in the organic movement, which I think is probably yet wider than the average agricultural operation that's out there. And, a lot of this stems all the way back to slavery and then the 13th Amendment and all of the systemic racism over time with respect to access to land. Some of the things we have to do is make sure ownership of land or access to land is opened up. At this point, almost every inch of ground is owned by somebody, which is also a very foreign concept to the indigenous way of thinking. We've been talking a lot with indigenous Vermonters who think it's such a strange concept to own land. How do you own land when we are so temporary and the land is so permanent, and yet we can take ownership of it? And so we have to be really thinking about ways to make, if there is going to be ownership, that ownership much more diverse and empower and really make up for centuries of wealth inequality. It's people ask me about diversity and Vermont, because we're one of the whitest states in the country. And, what policies do we need to do to diversify Vermont and make Vermont more welcoming? And folks often go first and foremost to criminal justice reform. And that already is a racist concept, that we have to do that because communities of color are more often involved in the criminal justice system. Well, why? And so we have to deconstruct all of that. But really, we have to pull back and recognize that no matter what color your skin, what gender, our fundamental values and beliefs are very similar in terms of wanting health for our family, economic well-being, good school systems, and so forth. So we have to make sure, even when we're talking about issues of racial diversity, whether it's agriculture or anywhere else, we don't fall into white supremacist and racist ways of thinking that it's about one particular thing that makes it harder for communities of color to participate, when in reality, it's our broad mindset that we clump everybody together and say, this group of people think this way. The way we all think is about family, health, food, shelter, education, and we have to make those things fully accessible and address racial injustice, historical wealth inequality, and so forth. So it's very complex, and we have to be tackling it every single day.
I listened to the podcast 1619 recently, and it really opened my eyes to why it's something like 98% of the land is owned by white people, and we're only 60% of the country. And that, to me, it just tells so much. How can the organic movement be involved in kind of dealing with that current statistic that is so wrong?
Well, it's hard because each individual farm often is just barely struggling and getting by as it is. So we don't consider ourselves wealthy. At the same time, we do own land, or we're in the process of owning more and more land as we pay our mortgages each year. And that in and of itself is wealthy compared to our BIPOC communities. And so we only view it from the lens we're in, and everybody is living in this precarious economic circumstance. And so we go, well, I'm not as wealthy as I'd like to be feeling secure. And yet we have to really look at, well, what's that mean for people who have much less wealth, much less land ownership? How insecure are they? And how do we find a way to make that balance? We're often asking those who are not at the extreme top of the economic ladder. We're asking those who are in the middle class to make up for the extreme wealth that's been concentrated to the top. And so part of, again, my political and my social and community values system is that we should be looking to where the massive wealth concentration has occurred. You look at Jeff Bezos, who's made tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars during the COVID crisis to add to his hundreds of billions of dollars he already has. I mean, what if 200 billion of those dollars were suddenly made available to communities of color to buy land? How quickly could the landscape change in terms of ownership and wealth? We have a system of wealth concentration, and that is an organized system through government and politics in terms of our taxation system and so forth that has kept some people down and has allowed a very few to concentrate huge sums of wealth. And we all need to do our part. There's no doubt about it. But if we band together in voting and in participating in democracy, that would be a much quicker way to adjust what's going on out there in terms of this concentration of wealth to the hands of just a very, very small, 1 in 1,000 population, 0.1%, 0.01% of the population that really has massive concentrations of land. There are people out there that own, 6 and 7 and 800,000 acres. How's that working out for our society as a whole? So we as individual landowners need to be looking at opportunities where we can make our own land more available, but we also need to make sure we participate in the system that says, wait a minute, the concentration of wealth and land is pretty extreme in very few hands.
That's a basic concept in the organic movement, to have that eyes to acres ratio in balance. And I know, I've got invasive Canadian thistle on my land, and that's what everybody out here sprays for. It's like the justification to use the milestone, which actually has a really long, persistent lifespan in the soil. So it's contaminating all of our compost, anything that has been grazed on hay that has been sprayed with milestone. Even if you compost it for 10 years, you can't grow a vegetable in it. So it's just breaking our cycles here.
Whoa.
And anyway, I'm out there and I'm stabbing it, and I've got 5 acres to care for. There's an amount of land that makes sense. If you're a vegetable farmer, it's much smaller acreage. And of course, if you're farming grains or animals, it can be a lot bigger, but you still need to keep that eyes to acres ratio in mind. So I'm just curious, I'd love to hear a little bit about scale and organic. How big can organic get and still be real organic?
Yeah, I don't know that I really know the answer to that. I mean, on our farm, we produce about 20 acres of vegetables. We're doing 1,800 meat birds this year, and we took about 40 hogs to slaughter. We have a boar and 13 sows, and we sell a number of piglets in the spring. At this point, we probably have more land than we need for the scale of our operation. This land became available through the Vermont Land Trust, and we were able to get our hands on it. It's about 150 acres, probably about 120 of them open. So we still have about 60 acres that we have someone else hay just to keep it open and in rotation. It's a much flatter, more clay-like soil. And then we have 2 slightly sloped fields that are lighter soils that we're able to grow our vegetables on. And we rotate and grow on about half of our land that's really cultivatable and arable for our system. And we could use more people on this land. We could use an animal operator who wants 60 acres to rotationally graze animals on. We have a barn that we keep our pigs in, and they have access. We use about 15 acres for them. But as far as vegetables, clearly the human power to acre ratio for vegetables, you need far more people than you do for, say, grains or animals. But I don't know officially sort of what those ratios are.
Yeah, I think it depends. We've got a 40,000 acre real organic project farmer out in Idaho, and he only has 400 head of cattle that he kind of mob grazes across that land. But
Wow.
His eyes are very skilled, and so he can really transform that land, keep an eye on invasives and know where to move the cattle in order to heal it. So I think it does depend, but it's an important thing to think about. If you're having to resort to chemicals as the solution, maybe you have too much land.
Yeah,
I'm wondering,
we have poison parsnip in Vermont, and we make sure as it's just starting to flower, we go around and cut it, and it's a half a day for one of our employees all to go around and cut it and make sure it doesn't touch them, because it can really create quite a rash. And we try to find a day that's not as sunny and maybe a little bit damp to do it. But we've noticed over these last 6-7 years how many fewer there are now than there were, because we don't let it go to seed. And again, that's that longer term watchful eye for your land, that if you do the hard work year over year, the hard work gets a little bit easier each year because you've built your soil, or you've knocked back the seed population of that invasive species, or just even a typical weed. So organic farming is doing the hard work to make it easier.
Yeah, and related to that, because we don't have these external costs affiliated with the way we farm, there are also so many other benefits to many small farms and regionalizing our food system beyond the lack of using chemicals and the environmental benefits of small farming. Can you touch on some of the community benefits to keeping small farms in business?
Well, I think typically when you do have a smaller farm, you typically also have higher labor costs. Higher labor costs means more people locally getting paid money that they are then spending locally as well. So when you grow your food organically and you're trying to build your nutrients by cover crops and the work you're doing on your own land and composting local ingredients to make your compost, you're keeping your economy and your ecology local. And so as you have more folks farming in a real organic project kind of way, you also then have more folks living closer to the land. You're commuting less, which means hopefully less climate impact. You are doing a better job building your soil, which means a water quality impact. That's a positive result, especially when right now we're having much more severe rainstorms. If you've got healthier soil, they can absorb that rain better like a sponge, as opposed to it just hitting the surface and running off and taking nutrients with it that then harm our waterways. And again, if people are working and living in closer proximity, you start to build stronger community. When you have full-on commuting communities, nobody even knows their neighbors. So as you know your farming community and your soil community, you get to know your people community better as well.
There has been some critique to organic that because the yields are lower, that we need more farmland in production. And so this means more land taken away from, natural forests or just being left alone. I wonder if you could talk about that misunderstanding that people have who have that critique.
Yeah, there is a critique out there that organic has lower yields, but studies I've seen show that over time, on average, organic acreage grows more per year than non-organic acreage because you don't have the same risks of the monocrop agriculture systems. When you're diversified, you might have a lesser year in one or two crops, but a boomer year in 4 or 5 other crops. And so by being organic, by being diversified, by rotating your crops, you actually can get similar, if not greater yields than conventional agriculture. So my understanding is there are studies that debunk the yield myths, but also we can think about what we eat. A far greater consumer of land is the scale of animal agriculture. And when you are growing, 10 acres of land of grain, in order to feed a couple of animals what they need, or whatever the ratio is, you could be growing a whole lot more other food matter for direct consumption than food that's being grown to feed animals, to feed humans. And I'm not a vegetarian. I raise pigs, I raise chickens, I eat them both. But I do think if we were to slightly diminish our meat consumption, we would more than make up for any kind of discrepancy in yield that organic versus conventional might have.
You mentioned that you raise pigs, and I know that there aren't very many there's not much of an organic pork market out there. Why is that?
Well, I think, again, a lot of people confuse GMO-free pork with organic pork. And I have had to turn away many, many, many businesses that have said, oh, we have leftover bread and we have leftover food from our food manufacturing. Can we give that to you for your pigs? And I say, well, unless you're 100% organic, I can't take those food scraps. So here's another farm you can give them to that is not a organic or real organic project farm. But for us, we don't make a lot of money on our pigs. We might break margin on it, but we feel that it's really important to have that offer out there because over time, we want to see all food produced in a way that builds the soil and doesn't degrade it. And we figure because we're so diversified and we can carry the hogs as sort of a cost neutral part of our operation, it also helps us keep an employee year round so that we have more consistent employee returning rates on our farm, that a cost neutral but keep an employee value is there for us. and that if we raise organic meat, again, at a similar price to GMO-free and other local meat that's around, because they have pretty high prices for what they do, we slowly will continue to shift the public mindset.
I've often wondered if that's a fallacy in the organic rules. Do you think that pigs should be able to eat local waste products, even if they're not certified organic?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I want to see us have firm rules so that those consumers of those producers of those products see that, oh, what I'm producing and the ingredients I'm using don't fit the organic mold. Maybe I can change that. And if we water it down, then that's kind of what we've done over time in society with all food production as well. If we just make it a little easier, if we just make it a little easier, if we just make it a little bit easier. And I would rather we do a better job of consumer education and increase demand. Because really the way to change production methods is through the consumer. I have someone on my political side who is in touch with me all the time. She's vegan. She's very concerned about animal agriculture and farming. And I say, fair enough, but people are going to eat pork. So would you rather it be pork raised the way that my farm raises pork, or pork raised that way that industrial pork is raised with, 3 breedings a year, piglets with their sows for just a few days, and things like that, versus ours, which they stay with for many weeks, and they have outdoor grazing and they're bred, some pigs twice a year, some pigs even just once a year, because we can't sell enough piglets in the fall. But I tell her there will be pigs consumed. So change the consumer interest and habits, and the farmers will change theirs. You cannot force farmers to change their habits if there's demand for the product. So to me, it's really about the consumer.
Yeah, I completely understand vegan people for their environmental choices, because 98% of the meat or more in this country comes from CAFOs. I think that we really have lost track of that's the way pretty much all of our meat is produced. And I'm excited about the consumer demand for pastured poultry, pastured pork, and actually enforcement of these organic rules that require grazing, right? It's part of organic. I'm wondering if you could link a little bit. And I hope people
also don't confuse pastured and organic. I mean, that's one thing. I certainly want far more pastured meats than the CAFO meats, but even unpastured, unless it's 100% pastured or 100% grass-fed, they tend to be pastured for a while, and then they're put into a CAFO to fatten up at the end. And so it's just, again, consumer awareness and information is really important.
That's something that the Real Organic Project also wants to change, is that you can graze your beef cows and then organically finish them in a CAFO. Yep. And that's just that is not an organic, that should not be allowed. Would you maybe we've had all of these fraudulent organic grain imports come into the country. And at the same time, U.S. organic grain farmers have really lost a price point increase because of all the fraudulent grains. And at the same time, we've seen a huge growth of CAFOs in organic, and the two seem to be very related to each other. So I was wondering if you could kind of touch on that issue and what you hope to, see change there.
Well, certainly we need national and international standards. We need the, quote, certifying companies that are willing to rubber stamp just about anything to be deeply investigated, so that they're not allowing fraudulent practices to be used. It is true. Organic food is expensive, and folks are trying, the consumers want to be buying. What this shows me is the consumers want to buy what they perceive as the healthier for themselves and healthier for the planet product, which organic is, I think, well received as such. But to address this, we don't need to water down organic. We need to build up the economy so that people can afford the real price of food and the real price of growing that food from a labor, from a land quality, from a water quality, from an air quality perspective. And so what you're seeing is the consumers are demanding better quality food, but instead of giving them the resources to truly be able to buy the better quality food, the definition of that better quality food is being watered down, and consumers, I would argue, aren't quite getting what they thought they were getting. And that, to me, is the biggest travesty with respect to government and government oversight and the accreditation and the certification process.
So how do we keep people from just walking away? We're talking about these issues. How do we keep people from throwing up their hands and saying, all right, I'm not going to buy organic food. It's all fraudulent.
Well, I think you have to help them discern what is large-scale commercial organic versus what is more real. So we've got the Real Organic Project label that many of us are supportive of and are members of. Myself and Rachel's, my spouse, who co-owns this farm. Our value set is to support the Real Organic Project. I think it's really important to consider helping consumers know how to ask their farmer what their practices are. In Vermont, we're fortunate. A lot of consumers buy local foods, which is certainly supportive of their community and supportive of their local farms. We need to help them understand the questions to ask their local producers, what practices do you use? What herbicides, fertilizers, pesticides, are they synthetic? But consumers need to ask, and they can ask at the grocery store. And the poor frontline essential worker is going to say, I don't know, I just restocked the broccoli. I just restocked, these grains. I don't really know. And you say, okay, could I speak to a manager? So I could ask a manager. And as consumers ask these questions more frequently, then both the workers will learn more because they're going to have to learn the answers, but also the management and the decision makers are going to learn more that consumers are getting more aware. Consumers want to know more about what's in their food. We better make sure we're providing the food that our consumers want. So what I would argue is that as consumers, go ahead and ask those questions and delve a little deeper. Don't just take the quick answer. I mean, I know a farm that says, do we use GMO grains? And they said, we only buy local grain. Well, that's not answering whether it's GMO or not, but it quickly switches the topic so people might hear what they want to hear. So as consumers, we not only need to give them the information, but give them that critical thinking skills and ask them to use their critical thinking skills, not that we give them to them, so that they delve a little deeper and ask those questions a little deeper. And then the stores and the local farms will adjust.
For me, the excitement is that the farmers that built the organic movement in the first place are here to speak out against the issues. If they weren't, I would walk away. I would give up. But the fact that we're coming together and talking about these issues and working to fix them gives me so much hope. And I think people now maybe only see the industrialized side and have forgotten the movement from the beginning and who was there. Or maybe they're so young they weren't around. I'm wondering who your mentors were and why you believe in the organic movement, who influenced you.
Wow. Well, I was very fortunate to be able to farm on a farm called Golden Russet Farm with Will and Judy Stevens for 3 years. After my first 2 years on that sort of communal farm where we were trying to figure it out as we went and probably did 85% of things in ways that were incredibly inefficient and not really conducive to the economic balance point of well-being. And then working on Will and Judy's farm where they had been farmers for at least 15, if not 20 years. Their systems are really sharp and efficient. And having done it inefficiently, it made me see the incredible amount of work that it saved to weed at the right time, use the right cultivation equipment, prepare the soil the right way, and all the different practices they use. So they really taught me more than I could ever be reasonably thankful for. I mean, I would just thank them over and over for what I learned from Golden Russet Farm, Will and Judy Stevens. Another mentor of mine, Andy Snyder, I met him in the legislature, but he also had been an organic farmer for about 20 years and did a lot of maple and vegetables. And Andy is someone who I look up to. And both Will, Judy, and Andy are people that I look up to not only for their agricultural just experience and prowess, but their human thinking, their critical thinking, their compassionate thinking. When I talk to almost every organic farmer I know, yes, they're trying to make a living and deal with the fundamentals of running a business. But I think when you've been farming organically for a long time, it starts to be ingrained in you to be thinking about the big picture, thinking about your community and your neighbors and all of our roles in a successful society. And so the decency and the quality of the people that I know who produce organic food, who buy organic food, it starts to be ingrained in our broader way of thinking. And that to me is incredibly invaluable as well.
Yeah, that transfer of knowledge and, that concept that, we're just Luddites and we're trying to farm the way 200 years ago couldn't be more wrong because of the level of knowledge and the continuing studies that are coming out to help organic farmers be better farmers. And I'm so grateful for that community where we share what we learn. And so I too have my mentors. I'm assuming that you are mentoring some young folks on your farm as well.
Well, we'd like to try. It's hard because I'm also involved in the political arena. I've been off the farm for 4 to 5 months every year for much of the last 25 years. I'm here early in the morning. I'm here in the evening. But it doesn't give me quite the ability to work alongside the crew the way that one would hope to if you're going to be a successful mentor in life, in agriculture. In the last 4 years as a statewide office holder in Vermont, it's no longer a 4 to 5 month job. It's pretty much year round. With campaigning every other year, it's really quite difficult. I suppose I've probably mentored many people in bits and pieces of their ways of thinking, but we've had a few people this year. Now we have everybody returning from prior years, and I'm sure seasonally I've mentored some people. I've had some folks say to me 10 years later that while they didn't fully appreciate it when they worked for me, and they thought that all these different efficiencies and all these different methods of doing things were a bit too managerial and not just letting people do their thing. 10 years later, they go, boy, I understand what you were saying a lot better now. And, and again, I'm sure there's times I'm not the best boss. I think that's true for anybody who's an employer, unless you're one of the perfect ones, and they're out there. But there's times that I'm sure my employees would not consider me their best mentor, but that as a whole, they tend to come back years later thankful for what their experience was and the things that I tried to teach them while also being their employer, which is tricky sometimes.
Well, I appreciate all the work that you do, both on the farm and for the people of Vermont. So good luck coming up. I do want to hear more about Full Moon Farm and the details there. I'd love to talk to Rachel later on and carry the conversation forward. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Linley.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you will subscribe, tell your friends, and leave us a rating and review so that others can find us. A video version of this interview is found at realorganicproject.org/episode 88. Please join us next time when our guests are Guy and Matt Schwanier, Real Organic Project certified dairy farmers who sell their milk through the member-owned Organic Valley Cooperative. To support this podcast and our certified farms, become a recurring donor at realorganicproject.org and get the benefits of being a real friend, including our book club, where you can ask many of our favorite authors your questions. Our next guest is Liz Carlisle. This is next week. She's the author of Healing Grounds, Lentil Underground, and Grain by Grain, which was one of my favorite books, actually. It was written with previous guest Bob Quinn. I hope to see you there.